Sometime in the first half of the 1st century BC, the Batavians arrived in the Rhine River delta. According to Tacitus, the Batavians were part of the Chatti as long as they lived across the Rhine. Then, being displaced by a civil war, they occupied the edge of the Gallic bank, which was uninhabited, and also an island nearby, which is washed by the ocean in front, but by the Rhine on its rear and sides. But why were these lands uninhabited? It was suitable for agriculture and for fishing. What happened that made the people living nearby to stay away? Was it something that had happened in living memory? It is not clear exactly when, but a few years prior to 113 BC, the northern edge of the European continent, as the Romans knew it, was hit by an exceptional flood. Many Cimbri, Teutones and Ambrones left their homes, in search for new lands. The Cimbri came from the Cimbrian peninsula and the Teutones were their neighbors. The Ambrones must have lived not far away. So what happened? Strabo writes that Cleitarchus is not to be trusted when he says that their horsemen, on seeing the sea flowing in, rode off at full speed, and yet narrowly escaped because they were almost overtaken by the flood. But we know from experience that the tide does not come in with such speed, but that the sea advances slowly. And we should, moreover, remember it is a phenomenon that occurs daily, which they could hear approaching even before seeing it. This could not, in any way, scare them to flee in such a great hurry, as if they had been surprised by some unexpected catastrophe. We have all seen the pictures of the 2004 tsunamis in the Indian Ocean, and the 2011 tsunami in Japan. We now know that what Cleitarchus describes could very well be true. Strabo also does not believe Ephorus when he writes that a greater number of them drown, rather than by war. If their houses are washed away, why then do they rebuild them at the same location? They must have been familiar with the regular tides in this vast area. The overwhelming flood is evidently a fiction. If Ephorus was right, we would have to look for an area that is relatively flat over a vast area, and is subject to frequent flooding. This resembles the land of the Chauci that the writer Pliny himself visited in the 1st century AD, a land with no trees, where the people live on small hills they built themselves. During a flood they are like sailors on a ship. When the sea recedes, fish are caught in their nets. They drink only the rainwater they collect, and warm their bodies by burning dried peat. Pliny observed this somewhere in the area south of the Wadden Sea, the part of a shallow sea stretching from Dutch Friesland to German Ostfriesland, where small hills as he describes are called Turpen, Weerden, and Wharf. But this does not yet provide an explanation for the island of the Batavians. A high-resolution D.E.M is available for Holland. In the north, no traces are visible that could indicate such a flood. Perhaps when the tsunami reached the dunes, it was too small for large amounts of water to spill over the top. But more to the south one anomaly stands out. There is a very wide, slightly elevated straight line from the coast going inland. There are a few other clues. First, we have to consider that the coastline was more to the west because of the ever-rising sea level. The main outlet of the Rhine was west of the coastal town of Kottweg. This is where it could have originated. Extending this line even further out to sea, we first have to change the map projection to UTM. This distorts Norway, Iceland and the Storegga slides, making them wider in a east-west direction. 3 major Storegga tsunamis have been identified so far, and the extended line points to the center of the southwestern slide. The explanation can be seen when you drop a stick flat on the water. The first waves are as straight as the stick is. But further away, the wavefront is looking more and more like a circle, as if it originated from one point. The line perpendicular to this circle goes through the middle of the stick. Looking at the Storegga slides again, we now have another proof the tsunami originated from this very long canyon-shaped area. The extended line is pointing to the middle of it. Having passed over the Rhine and the beach in the late Iron Age, the wave would have entered a vast area with elevated peat bogs. These have long since disappeared. But elsewhere in the country you can experience that putting weight on the peat makes it bulge upwards all around, because of all the water that is trapped inside. So a wide straight wave crest, such as that of a tsunami, can also result in a fairly straight bulge perpendicular to the direction the wave is propagating. Losing its speed, the sand it carries will settle at a right angle to the wide line. It is possible that the seawater was only part of the problem. This weight and the impact on the peat bog could have caused the peat to release a vast amount of the water it held. The momentum of the seawater and this extra water could have destroyed much of the island and the lands south and east of it. So the question is, can we prove the presence of these sand deposits? And does this sand indeed come from the North Sea beach? In 2003, Leiden University was excavating in Skip-Luden, and found a surface with disturbances that appeared to have been caused by something being dragged in a southeasterly direction. It was probably not related to the archaeology and did not make the excavation report. Now we know where to look and possibly how to recognize it. We could go and find out whether or not this was due to a tsunami. Finding a tree to date this event would be perfect. But a possible alternative is combining radiocarbon dating with a short dendro sequence from a twig. Back to the early written sources. The flood is first mentioned in Roman literature to explain why these peoples were on the move when they clashed with a Roman army in 113 AD. A few details of their travels are mentioned. They had first clashed with the Boii in the Hercynian forest and in Illyricum with the Scordesci, probably in present-day Serbia. They could have followed a trade route along the Danube towards Greece, but they were stopped by the Scordesci. So they moved back north to Noricum, where the Taurisci lived. After mounting tensions and possibly even skirmishes, these invaders still did not leave, so the Taurisci turned to their Roman allies for help. When the Romans arrived, they first built a fortress to block a passage to the Roman territory, but then waited in vain. Envoys from the Teutones came to apologize. They had not been aware of an alliance between the Taurisci and the Romans. They asked for land to settle. As these envoys made their way to their camp, the Romans used a shorter route to launch a surprise attack. This was an utter failure. The Roman army was destroyed, A complete annihilation was only prevented by an exceptional weather event with very heavy rains. The Cimbri and their allies did not march on Rome but headed west. In 109 BC they invaded the Roman province of Gallia Narbonensis, and were again confronted by a Roman army. They repeated their request for land, which was rejected. The Roman army attacked, but was wiped out. In 107 BC the Tigurini, coming from the Alps, ambushed a Roman army in Gaul. After heavy losses the Romans surrendered. One of their generals begged to release the remaining legionaries. The Tigurini let them go. In most other battles, the Cimbri and their allies, however, killed their prisoners. That same year the Cimbri and their allies were first defeated by a Roman army near Tolosa. They fled to Burdigala, leaving behind a large number of their baggage wagons. But next, the Roman army was ambushed by them, just outside Burdigala, losing their commander and many men. This time, the Romans had to leave much of their supplies in exchange for a humiliating retreat. In 106 BC the Romans sent an army to Tolosa to crush the local rebellion and free the Roman garrison. In 105 BC they were secretly let into the city. Next the city was sacked. Of the enormous legendary treasure, only the silver reached Rome. The gold disappeared. Another Roman army arrived, and when the Cimbrian envoys were nearly killed, the Cimbri and their allies destroyed both armies and their camps. The loss of about 80,000 troops and tens of thousands of support personnel in Orazio was one of Rome's biggest losses ever. It caused panic in Rome. The Terror Cimbricus was remembered long after. But again the Cimbri and their allies did not move on Rome. They turned west and moved into Spain. This gave the Romans time to mobilize new armies. Consul Gaius Marius had already started recruiting the landless poor, to form a more professional army with standardized legions, consisting of 10 cohort units, weapons and equipment. Marius also proposed giving the men land when they retired from active duty. In Spain, however, the Cimbri and their allies ran into troubles and turned back north, even all the way to northern Gaul, where finally the Belgi prevented them from entering their territory. Perhaps some of them managed to go home again, bypassing the Belgi. It is also possible they picked up extra men to replace the troops they had lost in their campaigns. In 102 BC, Rome receives reports that they are moving south again, with an estimated 200,000 warriors, or even 300,000 according to some sources. 30,000 Ambrones, 60,000 Teutones, 110,000 Cimbri, and another 100,000 women, children and other camp followers. North of the Alps they split into two groups. The Teutones and Ambrones intended on entering from the west, the Cimbri from the east. But now the Romans had a better trained army with Consul Marius himself as their commander, and he was not afraid to use unconventional tactics. The Cimbri entered the lands of the Roman allies, and after some skirmishes near Tridentinum, the Roman legions of another army retreated behind the river Athasis and destroyed the bridge. They were sent to protect the people who lived there. but now advised them to leave as they retreated to Placentia. It looks like the Cimbri finally got what they were looking for: new lands to farm. The other invaders first encountered the Roman army of Marius, near the place where the river Isara empties into the Rhone. Marius and his men remained in their camp when the Teutones and Ambrones attacked, together with the Tigrini. Not much happens and eventually they leave mocking the Romans. The Tigrini probably went back home to the Alps. The Teutones and the Ambrones follow the Rhone south. For several days Marius and his men followed them. Near Aqua Sextia some of Marius' support personnel, while trying to get the fresh water they desperately needed, accidentally ran into Ambrones relaxing near their camp and bathing in the river. The auxiliary forces are first at the scene to help Marius' men. The Ambrones attack them, shouting, "Ambrones! Ambrones!" These cries are recognized by the auxiliaries as their own ancestral battle cry, so they too shout "Ambrones," causing confusion. A battle starts and Marius reacts. He sends in his heavy infantry. At this point, in the literature, the Ambrones are described as the most warlike of the enemy. But the Ambrones were not prepared for battle. Without all of their arms and no plan, they were slain in the field. And then in their camp, most of whom had taken refuge there, were killed. The remaining force of the Teutones now was too small. They were destroyed a few days later. Many camp followers who were not killed chose to commit suicide. After celebrating their victory and burning the weapons that were seized, Marius began to move his troops to reinforce the other army. In 101 BC they joined forces and encamped near Placentia. The Cimbri envoys asked for land, which was refused again. A few days later Marius chose the battlefield, and agreed with the Cimbri leader on the time and the place. Without the support of the Teutones and the Ambrones, and now against two well-trained armies, the Cimbri were finally defeated. Marius was aware the Tigrini were nearby as a possible reserve for the Cimbri. But when the Cimbri were losing the battle they were not seen again. Most of the Cimbri warriors died. Many women killed their children and themselves, and the others were enslaved, ending this threat for Rome. A few decades later, the slaves made the history books one last time. Some of them must have been among the slaves who rebelled with Spartacus as their leader, threatening Rome again. But this time, the captives that were still alive after the battles were all crucified along the Appian Road. In 100 BC the Senate adopted the Lex Appillae Agraria, a law that made it legal to evict the last remaining Cimbri farmers. So maybe after so many years some families finally came home, near the place they fled long ago because of the massive flood. Using the distance between the different battles and the journey back to the land of the Belgi, it is possible to estimate the time it took to get from the Cimbrian peninsula to the first reported battle in Noricum. Therefore, the tsunami must have occurred in the year 120 BC plus or minus 4 years. Can history repeat itself? The dunes are higher than in pre-Roman times. And at Kotvek the Rhine no longer flows into the sea. This gap in the dunes is closed. The water now enters the sea directly north of the Marsflakte. the part of Rotterdam harbour that was built out into the sea. A Storegga tsunami takes 2 to 3 hours to reach the Dutch coast. But at the moment there is no early warning system out at sea. And it takes 2.5 hours to close the Maasland flood barrier. The other major barrier that has to be closed is the Eastern Scheldt storm surge barrier. This takes 75 minutes. However, these barriers are not designed to stop a tsunami. But they may well be capable of stopping it, if we can close them in time. The carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere is rising rapidly. One of the problems is that it is not possible to verify the climate models if an essential parameter is much higher than all other values in the past thousands of years. If we superimpose the carbon dioxide graph over the temperature graph, it seems that a new equilibrium that fits the carbon dioxide level of today is more than 7 meters above the current sea level. As far as we know now, the maximum sea level rise in a century has been about 2 meters. We are now just getting up to speed with a predicted +1 meter in the year 2100. But in 2200 we could expect +3 meter. Or perhaps even 1 or 2 meters more. Because we are in uncharted waters. Becoming carbon neutral will not stop the sea level rise until there is a new equilibrium. At some point, all this extra weight could trigger another tsunami. A seafloor scan of the area where the Ambrones tsunami originated from shows this canyon still has fairly steep slopes. And there's the risk that rising water temperatures could one day cause a catastrophic release of trapped methane. Or an earthquake could do the same. Should we be worried? What is also clear is that earlier, in about 6200 BC, a much larger tsunami swept across Dogger Land in the North Sea. Much of the land was lost and not long after, it completely disappeared beneath the waves. The tsunami must have also hit the Low Countries. This makes the discovery of a wooden sculpture, and the comments of the people who found it interesting. They were working on leveling the bottom of a pit to build the Volcarac sluice complex. They had come across an oak sculpture that was later carbon dated to around 5400 BC. However, with a difference of 500 to 1000 years, this sculpture cannot be linked to the tsunami. But it was found in the peat between the roots of one of the oak trees, 8 meters below sea level. These trees had snapped. This must have been done by a tremendous force. And they had all fallen over in the same direction. That of the new road. This road is in a southeasterly direction. The peat was estimated to be of the same age as the sculpture. But oak trees prefer more arid conditions. And they were close together. So it is possible that these trees actually grew much earlier, when the groundwater and the sea level were several meters lower. With the right conditions for peat to grow and accumulate some time later, centuries later, the sculpture could have been left there as a sacrifice, lost or even washed up by waves. If this damage was indeed caused by the Doggerland tsunami, it would mean that a huge tsunami could one day indeed breach the Dutch coastal defenses. What is already certain is that we, the Dutch, will have to leave these lands again. In a gradual withdrawal we can plan, or suddenly as a result of a tsunami. A 19th-century poem by de Genestedt translates as, "There is a time to arrive. There is a time to leave again." You've heard that before. But do you understand what this actually means?